Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for being here, and welcome to the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion Annual Meeting Symposium, The Biology of Resilience, How Faith and Science Communities Can Work Together. My name is Curtis Baxter, and I'm one of the organizers of this session this morning, along with my colleague, Dr. Say Kim. I want to thank her very much for her hard work in bringing us together. I work at AAAS in the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion program, also known as DOZER. We're one of 9 AAAS programs. We were established over 20 years ago, and next year will be our 25th anniversary. And I look forward to anticipation to what 2020 holds for our program. The DOZER program builds upon the AAAS commitment to relate scientific knowledge, technological development to the purposes and concerns of society at large. And we do this by facilitating conversations between the scientific and religious communities. And we carry this out through a variety of public events and projects. Just like at the public event you are at today here at this symposium, we cover a lot of topics and science topics that you can tell here on the slide. For instance, last year we engaged on the topic of gene editing and its implications and impact on human society in the future and right now. We've also talked about had other speakers engaging with AI at our holiday lecture that we hold every year at AAAS HQ right on 12th and 8th Street here in Washington, D.C. So if you're in the area, please stop by. It happens in December, and always be on the lookout on our website to find that information. We've also had topics covering the Paris Climate Agreement and how religious leaders played an impact on that as well. All of our public events, just like this one, are recorded and can be viewed on our DOZER webpage. In regards to our projects, both current and ongoing, we facilitate a lot of conversations, and for instance, in regards to the science and theological education programs where I work at specifically, our flagship program, the Science of Seminaries Project, works with theological education institutions across the country to help them integrate and work with them to incorporate science into their core theological courses and curriculum. And we do this by assisting project faculty with resources and connecting them to local scientists to be able to help them navigate local and current and mainstream science and science research. Another big resource that is being developed out of this project is the Science to Wine Angle video series, which are brief, engaging videos that can be used in a variety of settings and that have world-class scientists talking about a lot of different topics, including cosmology, discovery of exoplanets, as well as neuroscience, genetics, and even discussions about the discovery of the fossil Tiktaalik. And if you want to know what that is, you'll have to watch the video to figure that one out. As well as we have other projects ongoing, is the Engaging Scientists Project, where my colleagues work to help scientists in the lab as well in the classroom to be better communicators of their science, research, and work to faith communities. As most of you are probably well aware, a large majority of the American population are religious, roughly about 70%. And the scientists are out there engaging with those publics, and they probably don't even know it. So my colleagues in this project hold a number of workshops in science societies to be able to give those scientists a toolkit and to give them a new skill set to be able to be better communicators of their science. A resource that has been developed and some more to be developed out of this project is a booklet that gives best practices and skills and resources for those who want to engage in dialogue with the religious public. Some completed projects in the past that we've had is the Science for Religion Reporters Project, where we work to help religion reporters who aren't necessarily scientists or have a big scientific background or background to be able to engage with science that crosses their beat. We used to invite them here to this meeting right here, AAAS Annual Meeting, where they can engage and talk to scientists. And next is another project, which is the Perceptions Project, which I had a little I worked on a little bit when I first started here at AAAS. And that was a project to bring evangelical pastors and scientists together to talk about some of the perceptions that was out there in the public square of one another. And this was a big project that had workshops across the country and a big general conference here in DC. There was a number of resources that were developed out of that project as well. And I invite you to go to our website here, Dozer, AAAS.org/Dozer, and you'll find a number of our projects there and a lot of resources, as well as the videos, as well as the ScienceForSeminaries.org project, and that's where you can find the Science of Wide Angle video series, as well as you can find it on the AAAS YouTube website as well. And here are also our social media call handles, or call signs here. So please follow us on Facebook and Twitter. And I would like to mention there's 3 more opportunities where you'll be able to engage and see what Dozer does here at the AAAS Annual Meeting. This afternoon from 3:30 to 5, we'll be having a Dozer lounge session right here in the expo at the AAAS lounge area, where we'll talk about some of the best practices in engagement with faith communities. Later on this evening, from 6:30 to 8 o'clock, we'll be having a Dozer reception at the Omni Hotel in the Diplomat Ballroom. And there you'll hear a little bit more as well, and hear from our director, Dr. Jennifer Wiseman, about some of the projects and some of the things going on as well. And lastly, tomorrow at this same time from 10 to 11:30, my colleagues will be leading a session on scientific engagement with faith communities. It'll be here in the Marriott at Washington 6. And so please join us for those sessions if you have the chance. And with all that being said, again, thank you and welcome to this morning's session of biology, the study of biology, obviously the biology of resilience, how science and faith communities can work together. The study of resilience is a complex and multifaceted field involving neuroscience, medicine, and sociology. For these contemporary times, investigating resilience seems to be of increasing import. This symposium strives to understand the biological and environmental conditions that surround resilience in humans. Some questions that arise from the study of resilient communities include: why are some people able to pick up the pieces of their lives after crisis and flourish again? And are there ways for us to leverage what we know in science and medicine to create treatments for those suffering from trauma? And I imagine there'll be more questions that will be elicited from this conversation, and hopefully they'll be answered as well. Forefront research using animal models for stress tell us that resilience is a dynamic process, often involving neuroscience. For people, the effects of trauma can have long-lasting effects on future health and mental well-being. In light of such challenges people may face, there are evidence that worldviews and social networks, including faith and religious communities, can undergird important frameworks needed for resilience. This session this morning will provide an opportunity for dialogue on how the scientific and faith community can work toward the common good of building resilience. During this session this morning, we will hear from 3 very robust speakers, as well as a discussant who will bring the conversations together, followed by some Q&A time with the audience. And I will introduce each speaker in turn, starting with Dr. Scott Russo. Dr. Scott Russo is a renowned neurobiologist and professor in the Department of Neuroscience and Friedman Brain Institute at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. Dr. Russo is known for his contributions to understanding the neural and immunological basis of neuropsychiatric disorders. His translational studies have identified novel disease mechanisms in depressed humans that play causal role in the expression of depression-like behavior in rodent models. He has also identified novel circuitry in the brain that controls aberrant social behavior, leading to new perspectives about social dysfunction in neuropsychiatric illness. Dr. Russo has been a highly prolific over the past decade, having published over 100 peer-reviewed original research manuscripts in journals such as Science, Nature Medicine, Nature Neuroscience, and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. He has received numerous honors and awards in recognition of his work, including being named a Kavli National Academy of Science Frontier Fellow in 2009. He received the Johnson & Johnson IMHRO Rising Star Translational Research Award in 2011, and elected Fellow of the American College of Neuropsychopharmacology in 2016. That's a mouthful right there. And if you will, please join me in welcoming Dr. Scott Russo to the stage.
Thank you, Curtis. The college has decided to change their name, actually shorten it from the American College of Neuropsychopharmacology for that exact reason. So this is an interesting venue. I think this will be the first time I've presented in this type of venue, so I'm very excited. I apologize if I'm not clear, so please feel free to interrupt if I've gone too science jargony for people. As Curtis mentioned, though, my lab is really interested in kind of understanding the interface between our biology and behavioral resilience. And to do that, we use a combination of tools. We oftentimes start with human disease, meaning that we look at the biological underpinnings of a particular disease and we try to develop animal models which then allow us to test novel pharmacotherapies or understand the mechanisms of resilience in far greater detail. So I'm going to tell you about some of our studies where we've identified disturbances in peripheral immune function and how it can cause behaviors that we think are related to depression or anxiety. And then I want to tell you a little bit about our studies of active coping and resilience, to give you a perspective on how we might be able to use these types of models in order to understand resilience, but also in order to develop effective either pharmacotherapies or even behavioral therapies to combat these disorders. So these are two definitions of resilience. I wanted to put these up here just to highlight. Resilience is a complex thing to define, and there really is no one-size-fits-all definition. Even when you're talking about the same thing like stress, definitions can vary across organizations or definitions of particular phenotypes. So the top one is a definition provided by the American Psychological Association. I won't read it verbatim, but I'll let you guys take a look at it. The next is a definition that me and my colleagues had come up with, and really it was to capture what we were doing in preclinical models. And I think the key to our definition is that resilience really is the capacity of an individual to avoid negative social, psychological, and biological consequences of extreme stress on psychological domains. So resilience is not necessarily an umbrella term. And I'll give you one example of this. There's evidence that high-functioning, resilient individuals that resist the development of psychopathology in midlife go on to have greater risk of heart disease and cardiac events later in life. So you have to think about what you're talking about when you're defining resilience. In our context, in the context of my talk today, I'm going to be referring to resilience to the psychological and biological impacts of chronic stress. So what's our preclinical model of resilience? It's based on the idea that humans experience psychosocial stresses across the lifespan, and that not all of us develop any significant diagnostic psychopathology. So this is a bully model in mice. Everybody can understand how bullying in humans can cause psychopathology. In fact, it's estimated that bullying in children is associated with a 10 to 15% greater risk of the development of anxiety and depression. And it's associated with an increase in suicidality. So bullying is a massive problem in our society. And we've decided to develop animal models of bullying, or social subordination would be the scientific term, that allow us to recapitulate aspects of psychopathology in mice that we can then test causal mechanisms. So let me just spend a little bit of time on this, because people oftentimes ask me, how do you make a mouse depressed? And I want to say that we don't make a mouse depressed. What we do is we use things that we know induce depression in humans, we apply them to preclinical mouse models, and then we measure domains of behavior or physiological responses, like stress hormones, for example, that correspond to what we know of in human diseases. So our model, which I said is a bully model, we select larger, slightly aggressive mice to be the bully, and we then expose them to an intruder mouse that's coming into their home, and they get subordinated for about 5 minutes each day, followed by a 24-hour sensory period while they're housed in sensory contact but not physical contact next door. This occurs for 10 days, and what happens is that the animals develop a string of symptoms, which are shown to the right here, which we think are related to human psychopathology. So the animals are less likely to explore open environments and forage for food. We think this is akin to anxiety-like disorder or anxiety disorders such as agoraphobia in humans. They release a lot more stress hormone, which we know also occurs in human stress conditions. They don't sleep as well. They actually have a poorer quality of sleep and spend less time in REM, which we also know is associated with psychopathology. They develop effectively type 2 diabetes. They overeat. They have insulin insensitivity, and effectively have changes in feeding peptides that look kind of like type 2 diabetes in people. They are more likely to become addicted to every addictive substance that we've tested so far, from alcohol all the way up to methamphetamine. They show anhedonia, meaning that they don't find things that are naturally pleasurable to be pleasurable anymore. And lastly, they are profoundly avoidant of other social beings. They avoid not just the bully that attacked them, but they avoid friendly cage mates that in the past they had been perfectly happy with interacting. So we know these are things that are directly attributable or directly definable in human psychopathology, and we think that by understanding the biology that drives these in a very closely related mammalian species, we can then understand aspects of human disease. But in the context of resilience, this we feel is the most important idea that comes out of this model, is that not every individual that experiences this social stress develops significant pathology based upon some of the behavioral markers I just defined. So this is showing across the entire population of mice that were exposed to social subordination, the degree to which they become socially isolated or socially avoidant. And as you can see, there's two distinct or two different populations across a continuum, from those that avoid in red to those that don't avoid in blue. So we've termed these two populations susceptible and resilient populations in response to social stress. It is important, though, as we start to think about resilience, that the resilient population isn't resilient to all of the negative effects of chronic stress. They are also displaying certain symptoms of anxiety, meaning that they're kind of unwilling to go out and explore their open environment and forage for food. But they do resist metabolic syndrome, they resist addiction liability, they resist anhedonia and social avoidance behavior. This is an active process. As I mentioned, it's not simply that these animals are passively responding or passively not responding, I should say, to the stressor. They seem to be engaging in very active behavioral and possibly biological processes that help protect them from the negative effects of the social stress itself. So these are just some examples of active behavioral coping that we've identified versus those that are passive. So mice that are susceptible following social stress When they are being attacked or being subordinated by this aggressive mouse, they oftentimes show a I give up posture. They go back on their hind limbs and they put their hands up and say, okay, I'm done, you won. Whereas the animals that ultimately are resilient are showing far more active behavioral coping processes. They'll fight back occasionally so that they prevent significant subordination. They run away more often, so they get out of the situation in which they find to be traumatic. These are associated with active biological processes that also protect the individual from at least the psychological aspects of the social stress. So how do we use these models to better allow humans to cope with disease? Because we're not really interested in mouse psychopathology. We're using this model, importantly, we're using this model to understand human disease and to treat it better. And I think I'm going to talk about some of our most promising findings, but I want people to think about not just drug therapeutics. Obviously, I'm an NIH-funded investigator, so one of our goals is ultimately to identify biology that we can target by drugs. But think about these in the context of different types of therapies that are not necessarily drug targets, for which faith and religion is a major therapeutic outlet for individuals. At the very end, I will mention just a few studies, because they're not my own, but I want to mention a few studies that kind of pull this idea together, that being parts of a community or being engaged in behavioral therapies can help to mitigate some of the negative effects of social stress at a biological level. So here's a finding that has been tossed around in the literature for years. The idea that inflammatory diseases run the risk of greater prevalence for psychopathologies. So if you look at this table, this shows a couple of bona fide general medical conditions that are associated with an increased prevalence for depression. And you can see that it's quite striking. Asthma, for example, which I have, this scares the crap out of me, has an 18.1% prevalence rate for depression relative to healthy individuals without asthma. That's terrifying. But what it suggests is that some process underlying the expression of asthma is causing psychopathology, not just the condition of asthma itself. So this led investigators to start thinking about how the immune response, or I'll say the word inflammation quite a lot, because these are diseases that are associated with high levels of inflammatory load. How is it that inflammation or immune responses can control a behavior? How is it that our peripheral body is controlling our brain to control a behavior? And this has been a central question in the field. But if you think about it, how many people have had the flu this season? I luckily took the shot. I didn't have it. But how many people have just been sick this season so far? I know I have. I have a 1-year-old at home that's in daycare. Been sick a lot this season. But what do you feel when you get sick? I don't want to get out of bed. I really don't want to see people. I just kind of feel down and gloomy and depressed. Well, this isn't just because you're sick. This is actually because your body is trying to fight off the infection that you have. And as a consequence, the molecules that your body is producing now impacts your behavior, causing what we describe in the scientific community as sickness behavior, but it has a lot of overlap with psychiatric illness, in particular with depression. These are some of the same symptoms that we feel or that we diagnose depressed individuals with. So I've only got about 5 minutes. I'm going to go a little bit quicker, but the idea being is that chronic stress can subjugate the immune system and actually cause depression in and of itself. A meta-analysis of a lot of clinical studies have shown that high inflammatory load is associated with major depressive disorder. And so our question was, does the peripheral immune system cause stress vulnerability? And are resilient individuals somehow immune to the effects of chronic stress at the level of inflammation? So we measured, this is the measurement of an inflammatory molecule in the two subpopulations of susceptible and resilient mice. And you can see that susceptible mice have a much higher inflammatory load as a consequence of their exposure to this social stressor. If you make mice that lack this inflammatory molecule, so you remove the inflammatory molecule from their immune cells themselves, you can make them more resilient to the effects of social stress. So this really suggests that something in the peripheral immune system that's inflammatory in nature is interfacing with the brain, which at this point we didn't know why, but was interfacing with the brain to control social behavior or negative social behavior as a consequence of stress. And if you treat these animals with a therapeutic that sequesters up this inflammatory molecule, you can also promote more social interaction and prevent the negative impacts of social stress on social behavior. So how does it do this? I mean, this is the real question. How is it that inflammatory molecules are interfacing with the brain to control behavior, when we know that the brain is protected by a barrier called the blood-brain barrier? So we hypothesized that possibly stress wasn't only causing inflammation in these susceptible mice, but that actually what it was doing was breaking down the barrier to your brain, allowing for your peripheral body, i.e. through the bloodstream, to better communicate and access brain circuits. And so we thought that this model would suggest that the vessels in your brain, the blood vessels, were breaking down. And this is showing a blood vessel in the brain, so you can see this open space is the inner portion of the blood vessel where the blood would be flowing. You've got two endothelial cells coming together, causing the blood-brain barrier to stick together and prevent things from coming outside. And what chronic stress does is it opens up, it damages these endothelial cells that line your blood vessels within the brain, causing basically holes in the blood-brain barrier, allowing then for things in the blood to get in, presumably. I'm going to skip to this slide just to show you. This is the inflammatory molecule that I had shown earlier that stress was inducing in blood. We were able to show that through these damaged blood vessels, all these green dots are peripheral inflammatory molecules. All these green dots are infiltrating the brain tissue through these damaged blood vessels, which are labeled in red. You can see that right here. So chronic stress in certain individuals causes damage to the blood vessels, allowing for things to float in, if you will. And resilient mice show no evidence of this, despite the fact that they went through the exact same psychosocial stressor. So I'm going to just end with this right here. Basically what we've used a preclinical model to identify social stress-induced damage to the neurovasculature that can allow for peripheral immune organs and systems to interface with the brain to control behaviors that are associated with depression. So the idea being is that therapeutics aimed at two different levels. One, preventing the inflammation itself, and two, preventing the neurovascular damage might actually be effective from a therapeutics perspective in reversing depression or treating depressed individuals after experiencing a traumatic event. And so with Johnson & Johnson, our pharmaceutical partners, we've been pursuing this line of investigation. They've initiated a phase 2 trial for their drug. But I think for the purpose of this talk, I want to highlight there's more and more evidence that faith, religion, psychotherapy. I'm a psychologist by training, so I think the first line of defense for any of these things to promote better resilient responses in our communities should be active psychotherapy. These things, not only do they alter the trajectory of stress-induced traumatic illnesses to promote resilient responses, but they actually reduce some of the same inflammatory molecules in the blood of people that they've tested them. So faith-based programs have shown longitudinally to cause lower levels of inflammation in the subjects that they've tested, as is the case for various psychotherapies like cognitive behavioral therapy. So I think from a faith-based perspective, what we should be thinking about is understanding the broad array of active mechanisms that these types of experiences are changing in our bodies to promote resilience to stress. So I'm going to end it there and thank the people in my lab that did the work. In particular, I'd like to thank Georgia Hodis, Carolyn Menard, Madeline Pfau, Kenny Chan, Florin Kathamas, who've done the primary amount of this work. And thank you for your attention. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Russo. Our next speaker is Dr. Farha Abbasi. Dr. Abbasi is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry at Michigan State University and core faculty member of the Muslim Studies program. She is from Pakistan and settled in the United States in the year 2000 with her 3 daughters. In January of 2009, Dr. Abbasi received the American Psychiatric Association's SAMHSA, SAMSHA Minority Fellowship. She used the grant money to create awareness about cultural competency, to redefine it as not just tolerance, but acceptance. Her areas of interest are cultural psychiatry and teaching medical students how to provide culturally appropriate care to Muslim patients. She works directly with the Muslim American community to encourage integration rather than isolation from mainstream society. Dr. Abbasi's work as a psychiatrist has led her to address the barriers that stigmatize and silence mental health. She is the founding director of the annual Muslim Mental Health Conference. In addition, she launched a global Muslim mental health conference in Malaysia and Jordan. She is also the managing editor of the Journal of Muslim Mental Health and director of the Muslim Mental Health Consortium at Michigan State University. She works relentlessly and tirelessly towards one goal: learning to coexist and go beyond our differences to reach the common point of peace and prosperity. And I think that's a worthy goal that all of us should think about. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Abbasi to the stage.
Great to follow after Dr. Russo. Let me start with the traditional greetings. Assalamu alaikum, peace be with you. It is great as a scientist and as a faith-based practitioner to be able to do that in a scientific setting. So, I just moved the slides to. I want to talk about the concept of resiliency in Islam, basically. And it is very interesting. To be a Muslim, you have to believe, you have to say, and you have to act. So it's not just by being born in a Muslim family that you become a Muslim. You have to have the belief, the biology, and the practice to be a Muslim. So that's said and done. Islam is a religion which brings it like the practice and the meditation and the belief system, it is all combined. And that is why I feel like the concept of resiliency is very inherent in the concept of Islam. So I want to talk about the concept of ummah in Islam. Ummah literally means community, of bringing people together. So Islam starts on a very individual basis, but is always spreading out to the community. So everything that you do or believe starts with your own well-being and wellness, but translates into welfare for the community. So basically, it talks about essential unity. And we know as mental health provider, or like what Dr. Russo was talking about, that when you are stressed or depressed, the first thing we tend to do is isolate, disconnect. Even if we study the suicide risk behavior models, we know that people who are isolating, there is a high risk of them acting on these impulses. So bringing in the community becomes a very important concept. Right now, we have an epidemic of isolation in the country or in the world. I just found out that UK, for the first time, has hired a secretary that's whole purpose would be fighting this epidemic of loneliness in the society. Islam does not have a prescribed priesthood, but the concept of faith leaders is very integral. They do become your first contact person, first responders, first de facto mental health counselors. So when I started doing the mental health resiliency work in the Muslim community, I realized if I am going to affect the stigma or impact the stigma, I have to bring the faith leaders into the conversation. So this is what we have been training, first aid mental health training for Imams, and you see it's still a very academic conference. We present the latest research, peer-reviewed research, but then we keep it very religious in flavor so that the Imams feel comfortable participating and coming to the conference. So this is what I was talking about. The two inherent concepts in Islam are welfare, wellness. And it starts with your individual well-being, the concept being that healthy, resilient individuals will tend to have healthier relationships. These relationships can translate into healthier family units, and then these family units, you can build healthy communities. So it's beautifully how every practice starts with your well-being and then goes on, it turns into an act of welfare. So basically, let me just quickly add one piece here. So you have heard about Sharia, a lot of words being thrown. Basically, Sharia is the constitution, basic rules that a Muslim is supposed to follow. And the first integral rule of that Sharia is preservation of your intellect. So I was amazed when I started learning the Quran that how much everything is dependent on your being intellectually competent or not competent. So I'm just going to quickly go through the 5 pillars. This is what I was talking about, that initially to become a Muslim, you have to say, no, that I believe in one God, no God but God. And by acknowledging that, you are putting a faith in a higher being. So you, in some ways, are being submissive, letting go of the control, but you also are feeling protected, that it's not only me whose everything is dependent on. There is a higher being taking care of me. And we see that concept very well when we do acceptance and commitment therapy. But I want to really focus on the prayer. Islam is the only religion where the prayer concept is very physically active. And you are performing this 5 times a day. We just talked about the HPA-X's and high stress levels of hormones releasing throughout the day. It's very interesting how these 5-time prayers is strategically distributed throughout the day. So whenever your cortisol level starts to go up, you take a break in the day. It starts with sunrise, ends with sunset. You are starting the day with meditation, and basically the prayer is kind of like a hatha yoga. Takes you 5 to 7 minutes to perform it. But interestingly, before going into prayer, you are washing yourself up, which is called ablution or wudu, which now I realize is nothing else. First thing is your personal hygiene and cleanliness, but the other thing is you are literally putting cold water on your pressure points. So you are running water on your pressure points. So you are already feeling relaxed. And when you go, you are doing yoga, and then you are prostrating, putting your head on the ground. So the blood is flowing to your brain, and you are feeling completely calm. So it's a combination of all that happening. And when you are, and of course, one thing is, again, the community piece of the prayer is you are praying in a group. And it's the concept of equity and equality. All of you are praying in one direction and together, standing together. So that's why it's interesting now, the research is showing us that sitting for long period of time is also like smoking cigarettes, right? So that concept is also being used here, that take break 5 times a day, so that you forget about the stress, you meditate, you relax, and you are rejuvenated to go back to whatever you were doing. So I wanted to show you guys the different postures. And if you see how when you stand together, how it feels like you become one. That's the concept of community again, the Ummah. You are all in one direction, you are all equal. The idea behind the welfare piece of it is that somehow you keep the connections and communications going. So when you pray, after the prayer, you tend to talk, socialize, find out who's sick, who's not doing well, who needs help. So the concept of the community model is strengthened 5 times a day. But you could do it on your own as well. Then comes the concept of charity, very inherently integrated into the system. Anything that's in excess should be shared. So it's not saying that don't live a comfortable life. Live a very comfortable life, enjoy life, do what needs to be done. But if you have extra, then share it. And very specifically calculated. Fasting, amazingly being promoted now. So you have the whole month of Ramadan that you're fasting. And now we are finding out the benefits of intermittent fasting, right? What we know is that the levels when we have high stress, high cortisol, or when we are eating, so what happens is when you have high stress levels, high cortisol, you are taking in more sugar. So your insulin levels go up. And what that insulin level does is deposit the fat not only on your liver, but throughout the body. And what the fasting does is bringing those insulin levels down. So Dr. Russo talked about diabetes and the connection. So when you are more chances, if you stay in high stress condition, more chances of you developing diabetes, especially diabetes 2, type 2. But when you're fasting, that glycogen store starts breaking down, your insulin levels start coming down. So you have literally physical benefits of it, but ultimately what we know is that when you fast, you also feel a deep connection, a spiritual connection to God. So you are feeling the spiritual benefits, the mental benefits, and the physical benefits. And the idea is, community-wise, the idea is it's encouraged that when you open the fast, so from sunrise to sunset you are fasting, but when you are opening the fast, it's encouraged to open it in a community setting and to share your meal with others. So that again, the wellness to welfare model is practiced. And of course, you realize that how emotionally vulnerable you become when you are not eating, when you are starving. And you realize the problem, right now we have a big epidemic of homelessness, like even in Lansing where I practice, 1 in 4 kids are going hungry. So, yeah, I'm good. So creating that awareness, the responsibility for thinking about the community. The 5th pilgrimage is the Hajj, that you only have to do once in your lifetime. Basically, we pray in direction of Kaaba in Mecca, and the idea is that once in your lifetime, go visit the Kaaba, understand where did Islam started, and again, It's very interesting. Kaaba is a central building, and you are revolving around it. That's the main concept of Hajj. And it kind of replicates the solar system too, like a central energy dissipating to all the other planets. This is Kaaba. And if you see people go in a clockwise way, idea again is your own sense of well-being, and then always you are in a community. An important piece here, if you see, men and women are not segregated. You are not segregated by class, gender, race, or it's like everyone is equal, moving in one momentum and one source of energy. So keeping that in mind, I created this model where mental health providers, so Michigan State University, we provide the mental health piece of it, and then bringing the faith leaders into this conversation and training, and the community leaders. Because if I see the hierarchy of collectivistic cultures, the first time you feel depressed or anxious, most probably you will go to a faith leader, then come to a mental health professional. Unfortunately, after the faith leader, they would rather go to a primary care setting because of the stigma. So by the time they make it to me or a mental health provider, they are either in a crisis situation where they need to be admitted, or they are in a legal problem. So it becomes too late to intervene. And again, this model was not only going to focus on fighting the mental illnesses. I wanted to do something proactively to augment the mental health. And when I started reading about the religion, I also realized that the origin of psychiatry started with Muslim scholars. They were the first one to establish the first psych hospital in Baghdad and Aleppo, Syria. A few of the initial hospitals were established there. And they used the word nafs, which is psychology. So they were talking about mental health. And the literature now is showing that even OCD, depression, anxiety, all had been described a long time before we started talking about it here. So that was and I'm going to leave with the concept. That's what I'm trying to do, is create a mental health community, bringing the faith leaders, bringing the other leaders in the community. And the concept is to create an inclusive society or community, supportive of each other, not only in needs of financial problems or physical need, but when someone is going through a mental health crisis, how does the community has to come together and support them? So under this, we have started, Imams are doing sermons, talking about depression, suicide, and also kind of the first thing, we see in clergies, rabbis, everyone, that we hear that they pray after the congregation, right? Like, pray for so-and-so going through a surgery. So what we have started doing is pray for someone suffering from depression or hospitalized due to psych reasons. So kind of breaking that stigma. But my focus is also a lot on the attitude of the Imams and their own mental health and well-being. So how do we increase acceptance in these Imams? How do we teach them how to talk about mental health, and how make it more inclusive for vulnerable populations like LGBTQ populations? And of course, make them aware of their own vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue, because we realized that in other religious studies, that rate of suicide was going up in clergies and rabbis, so we studied in Muslim community as well. And of course, the thing is, suicide technically is prohibited in Islam, but when we learn about underlying reasons, it is very clear that if you are competent and taking your life as an act of hopelessness and loss of faith, that's different. But if you are incompetent due to depression, anxiety, or any situation, then there is a whole level of forgiveness and acceptance. So using that, I think this was like a fast introduction. I will be here to answer any further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bassi. Our next speaker is Dr. Melissa Kelly. Dr. Kelly is Associate Professor of Pastoral Care and Counseling and the Faculty Director of the Masters of Divinity program at the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. Dr. Kelly is a fellow and nationally certified pastoral counselor through the American Association of Pastoral Counselors. She is also certified in thanatology, death, dying, and bereavement through the Association for Death Education and Counseling, and is the author of Grief, Contemporary Theory and the Practice of Ministry, published in 2010 by Augsburg Fortress Press. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kelly to the stage.
Hello, everyone. It's very nice to be here. And I appreciate, Curtis, all the work that you've done to pull this together for us. So this will sound a little different because I'm not speaking as a scientist. I'm not speaking as a physician. I'm speaking as a theologian. Oops. That's not right. That's not how theologians speak. Oh, Curtis, I might need a little help. Sorry. I pressed these arrows.
How about this? Oh, Lord. Can't touch this. It's not a touch screen.
Sorry.
Oh, you're okay. Let's just do it this way. We'll just go. Oh, there we go. There we go. I apologize for this. Let's try this one more time. Okay. Let's do it the old-fashioned way. Here we go.
Okay, so it's just this button. It's just, okay, yes. Thank you, Curtis. Okay, so I wanted to just offer a bit of a sense of how I'll be using terms in this presentation, and I'm going to start with the bottom one, my particular use of theology and community of faith. I am speaking as a pastoral theologian, which means that there's a particular focus on context and human experience and understanding how theology and context must speak to each other. I'm also speaking as a Christian, and I'm making no claims beyond my particular understanding of and work within a Christian context. It's my own faith orientation, and it's also the setting in which I teach and minister at Boston College. It's a particular slice of Christian thinking that certainly doesn't cover the waterfront. And so those in the room who also identify with Christianity would perhaps see some of this quite differently. So I want to say that up front. And then we've already been offered a nice definition of resilience, so I won't go back to that. But I do want to say just a word about grief and trauma. Some of what I'll be saying has to do with grief more than trauma, and so I think it's important to differentiate. I work with grief in the sense I'm adapting the work of R. Weiss, who talks about grief as distress following a significant loss. That's the sense in which I use grief as well. And in terms of trauma, I find very helpful the understanding of SAMHSA, and I'll just share that quickly, that we're thinking of trauma as resulting from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. I want to add that, as we know, of course, grief and trauma are not the same thing. I find very helpful the fairly new work by Lorianne Perlman and colleagues looking at the specific category of traumatic bereavement, ways in which grief and trauma may overlap, even though they don't necessarily always overlap. But that when someone may be experiencing traumatic bereavement, that's a different kind of grief, and it has to be understood and worked with in a very particular way. So for these next few minutes, I want to take up this question of the role of communities of faith in helping to cultivate and sustain resilience among those who have experienced perhaps grief and or trauma. Now, what can we say in just a few minutes? What I'd like to offer is a particular way of thinking about this through the lens of narrative and meaning making. So this idea of narrative, perhaps we're all familiar with it. We certainly know it's a strong emphasis in narrative therapy. We're understanding that people, seemingly cross-culturally as well, understand ourselves in terms of stories. If I'm asked to share a little bit about myself in a group of new people, at some point I'm going to start telling you a story about myself. Tends to be how we communicate, at least to a significant degree. And so my personal life story will have the elements that most stories have. There will be a plot to my story, the sequence of events that unfold over time. My story will probably have a theme or two, such as the importance of working hard or family first. There will be characters to my story. It's always interesting to me when I talk with students about this, how many will come, when they think about their own stories, they'll come to identify that they are not necessarily the major character in their own life story, which is interesting. And there can be cultural dimensions to that too. This last element, sense and coherence, I think is critical. We want our life stories to cohere, to hang together. Nobody wants to feel that they're living a story that makes no sense. And this idea of coherence to our stories becomes very important in times of loss and trauma. I find very helpful this term in the heading here, narrative disruptions. This is a term coined by Robert Niemeyer, who's at the University of Memphis, a constructivist psychologist. He helps us to understand that the meanings by which we're trying to organize and live our lives are embedded in our stories. When our life story is disrupted by loss, and I love this picture that I found amazingly, of pages just being ripped out of a story, that's what narrative disruption can feel like. The story I thought I was going to live, the story I want to live, is now impossible because it's been so profoundly disrupted. This quote by Jessica Stern in Bessel van der Kolk's book captures some of what I'm trying to describe here. Some people's lives seem to flow in a narrative. Mine, and she's describing trauma, mine had many stops and starts. That's what trauma does. It interrupts the plot. It just happens, and then life goes on. No one prepares you for it. And Robert Niemeyer describes the same experience in narrative terms. Like a novel that loses a central character in the middle chapters, the life story, disrupted by loss, must be reorganized, rewritten, to find a new strand of continuity, that's that sense, that bridges the past with the future in an intelligible fashion. None of us wants to feel we're living an unintelligible life. So, in terms of faith, why might narrative disruptions sometimes be so upsetting and painful? It's because of that connection to meaning. When our life stories are disrupted, so may our sense of meaning and our hope for the future. We may not even know how to live into the future. So what I'd like to do is just say a few things. This is, again, from a theological perspective, how to think about narrative in Christian theological terms. And I would say very simply, I think what I would want to say is that whatever the narrative disruption, my story is not over because I'm part of a much larger narrative. My story is embedded in an ultimately hopeful story. And we understand that as describing God's loving and ongoing creative activity in the world. I love this quote by the German theologian Jürgen Moltmann, who wrote, "In every end, a new beginning lies hidden." And I don't think he meant this in a simplistic Pollyanna sense. Our story can feel like it has come to a screeching halt. Yet, from a theological perspective, it hasn't, because it's always embedded in a larger story. And then to say a word about meaning, this is a definition that I developed because I find that meaning is so critical in my world, and yet so vague often in terms of what we mean. So just this first part, I would say, or I propose that it's the deep sense we make of things, the ways we understand the world, the purpose or goal of our lives, the core values by which we order our lives. That's what I mean by meaning. So we know that at a time of trauma or profound grief, people often struggle with questions that we could say are questions of meaning, such as, how do I make sense of this? I tell my students regularly, whenever we hear that question, and we hear it a lot in ministry, how do I make sense of this? It's a question of meaning. The story isn't cohering. It doesn't seem sensible. So what does that mean? Why did this happen? How could God have let this happen? What gives me hope now? These are all ways we might express a struggle with meaning. So to say just a word about meaning in theological perspective, I said something about narrative, now I want to say something about meaning. And I find that at some point when we are dealing with suffering and trauma and loss, we bump up against mystery. We want to know why, and we will never know why. Most of our questions about suffering take us to mystery. But what I want to propose theologically is that while we will never solve the mystery of suffering and loss, that doesn't mean our suffering is meaningless. And in the Christian tradition, we think of the ultimate meaning in all mystery as being grounded in God's unfailing love and care. I love this quote from Julian of Norwich, who was a 14th century mystic who had visions in her life and pondered the meaning of her visions for 20-something years. And what she came to in her pondering was that God is love, that is the meaning of life. And she wrote, "We are endlessly loved with an endless love." And then a quote by Diana Fosha, psychologist, also from Bessel van der Kolk's book, connecting this with resilience now. The roots of resilience are to be found in the sense of being understood by and existing in the mind and heart of a loving, attuned, and self-possessed other. Theologically, that takes me right to a passage such as Jeremiah 31, where we're told, I have loved you with an everlasting love. I wanted to mention briefly that a colleague and I did a study of people who had experienced a significant death, and our most important finding, to my mind, is that those who described a more secure style of attachment to God not only seemed more highly buffered from depression and grief, but also described greater meaning, greater stress-related growth, and more positive religious coping. Here's our diagram of the findings, and I know it's quite hard to see, but right in the middle is secure attachment to God, and that was our most significant finding. So these next few slides are some of the familiar scripture passages that perhaps you've heard that all, I think, contribute to a sense of secure attachment to God. 1 John 4, God is love. Those who abide in love abide in God, and God abides in them. Psalm 23, we are never alone. At the bleakest of times, even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me. We know that in our mourning, we are blessed and comforted. We know that God provides strength and refuge and help. And we are promised that Christ is with us to the end of the age. And then just a few comments on what does this have to do with the community of faith. Certainly all of us could, if Christians could, cultivate this sense of God as our secure base, our secure attachment on our own to some degree. But there is also something essential about being part of a community that reminds us of these truths. So a few thoughts on the role of the community of faith with regard to narrative. The community of faith recalls our faith story. When we gather each week, that's what we're doing, is recalling the story, reminding us that our story is part and embedded in this larger story. And we continue to live the story and bring it to others. What does the community of faith have to offer in terms of meaning? I'd like to suggest it models and mediates the security of attachment that God offers, and that we try to support meanings that are grounded in God's constant love and care and challenge those that aren't. From a theological perspective, we would say that all meanings are not created equal, and some do need to be challenged. And finally, another critical role of the community of faith with regard to meaning. We bear witness that each person is created in God's image and likeness. That means that each of us possesses an indelible God-given dignity. No matter what we have experienced in life, that can never be taken away or diminished. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Kelly. And now to our discussant, Ms. Kimberly Conkle. As a founder of the Building Resilient Communities Through Trauma-Informed Congregations Community of Practice, also known as TICONG, Kimberly facilitates a national, multi-sectoral, diverse working group of faith leaders, public health officials, providers, and peers. The TICON works to marry the intelligence of science with the wisdom of community by deploying evidence-based and promising public health practices to reverse the trajectory of the co-occurring epidemics of suicide, violence, untreated mental illness, and addiction. Kimberly was a Presidential Management Fellow at the National Institute of Justice, As the first non-political public health advisor in the Center for Faith-Based and Community Initiatives, Kimberly served as the co-chair of the Pandemic Flu Community and Faith-Based Preparedness Working Group and the chair of the C/FBO Technical Working Group in the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. She has been in federal service for over 18 years and counting. Kimberly served as a full-time mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Louisiana and Mississippi, where she was affectionately known as Sister Conkle. In regards to honors and awards, Kimberly is especially honored to have been awarded the 2018 Muslim Mental Health Advocate of the Year by the Center for Muslim Health and Islamic Psychology. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Conkle to the stage.
And I'll invite everyone to come up, and I'll just say a couple words as you guys, not everyone, the panelists to come up. Everyone. But maybe we should, just for a second, because we've been talking about, and you guys get to move, but why don't we all get to move? Everybody, if you'll please stand up just for a minute. And everyone has to stand up. Then we're going to raise our hands up high and stretch. Whoa, just stretch it way out. We've been sitting for a while. And then if you can, maybe just like touch your toes or get close, Stretch it out. And now you can say you went to AAAS and had a really moving experience. All right, have a seat, everybody. Thanks for playing my game with me. So I'm thrilled to be here. As a little girl, I wanted so badly to be a scientist. I used to get the ketchup and the hydrogen peroxide and the whatever else and mix it together and make it explode, So I'm very happy to be here and to be part of this discussion. I believe that we've spent a lot of time studying a lot of things, and we know a lot right now. And if you go, I did one time, I asked NIH to pull a bibliography together for me of what we know about adverse childhood experiences and resilience. And what I got back were 2 zip files full of information that I've yet to go through, and I'm going to have to find people to help me. That's how much we know about what we're talking about. I feel like it's time for us to have the decade of implementation and take what we know and evangelize this science to bring us into an era where this concept of faith communities and science working together is commonplace in our communities. And just a little tiny bit of history, you may remember that public health started with John Snow, and they were in London, the cholera epidemics raging through London, and Henry Whitehead, the priest, says, this one well, they're friends, this one well seems to have an issue. John Snow is a anesthesiologist, so he just knew that it wasn't something in the air, but he knew it was something contagious. We didn't quite know what. We didn't know what cholera was. But the priest noticed the wisdom of his community. It's the people that drink from this well that are getting sick. So that's why we shut the Broad Street well off, and that's how public health was started. It's always been a partnership that marries the intelligence of science. We needed John Snow to understand that it wasn't in the air. But we had to have Henry Whitehead, because John Snow would have never known that that well even existed. He didn't go to that neighborhood. So I'm thrilled to be here with an amazing scientist, a fantastic physician, and the counselor I hope I have when I grieve. And I'd like to ask you just to kind of spitball, what is it that those who are running, like this weekend, if you could give the message to the priest that's going to give the mass and the imam who's going to do prayer tonight, what is the one thing that they should know that they could do with your study, with your knowledge, with what you know? What's that one, if they just knew this, they could just do this. Is there something like that that you could share with us?
I think most important thing is the ownership, the stakeholdership, that we need each other. The interdependence has to be established, but at the same time with very clear boundaries. That I'm not expecting the imam to start treating my patients, and I am not going to start preaching religion. So I think once the boundaries are established and they understand that we are equal stakeholders in the well-being of the community, it's a natural alliance.
It's like a clarification of roles and like setting up like this is my stewardship, this is your stewardship. Let's be in partnership because meaning's kind of all over this. You have something to say, it looks like.
So I guess I would just add from my perspective that, I would want all religious leaders to keep communicating to their communities that we are never incidental to each other's well-being. That simply showing up has a power in terms of helping to cultivate resilience in all these ways that we've been describing. And not showing up has implications as well. So we are never incidental to each other's well-being.
So there's like this power, that there's power, there's something about the collective we're social animals. And so we have to be in connection with each other. This is an interesting psychiatrist in Memphis, Tennessee, Daniel Sumrock, and he says the opposite of addiction isn't abstinence, but it's connectivity. Kind of to your point.
Farha made a really interesting statement during her talk, saying that by the time she sees these individuals, it's usually in the context of a full-blown trauma or a full-blown crisis. I think that's the issue. It's training people in the community to understand risk factors and vulnerabilities, to identify them early, and to have a pipeline for them to be able to seek out help. Because that is the issue. You see people in the emergency room, and by that point, something really bad has probably already happened.
Right. So what are some of those signs and symptoms of toxic stress, or like those things that before we get to that place where we're at the ER or something horrible's happened, how can we here in this room, because we're members of communities, when we go home today, how can we be aware enough to know, hey, this member of my community looks like they need a little bit more help or more something?
I think this first aid mental health training has been bridging that gap really well. Unfortunately, I don't know why is it still underutilized. I think it's such a simple, straightforward thing to bridge the gap between the mental health providers and the faith leaders.
So mental health first aid is an 8-hour, I'm actually a mental health first aid trainer. It's an 8-hour course that you take. It's just kind of like getting a CPR. Are there mental health first aid trainers in here? That'd be cool. Oh, yay, hi. We should talk later. But basically you learn kind of signs and symptoms, what is mental health, what is mental illness, how to help somebody who's suicidal, how to recognize if somebody's having a drinking or an addiction problem, etc. I obviously teach it, I really recommend it, and you should be able to, in your community or on your campus, be able to get access to that training for free. But you can reach out to me and I'll give you help finding that if you'd like. So basically what in mental health first aid is not the only training, but there needs to be essentially if you're talking about evangelizing science, we're kind of evangelizing psychiatry, psychology, and what we know about just behavioral health in general and how we talk about it.
Let me add one more thing quickly. I think biggest barrier is stigma. And stigma arises from keeping things hidden, silent, and that's where the shame comes in, and that's where you don't want to So I think the first thing I have learned is to give visibility to it.
Right.
Bring it out and open, have these candid communication and conversations.
And Dr. Russo, did you want to add something? If you forgot, that's okay.
I forgot.
Okay, that's cool.
I can make something up.
No, it's all right. We can. During Dr. Kelly's talk, I really couldn't help but think about something that Dr. Kay Jamison, who's a professor at Johns Hopkins, said one time. She was teaching the medical school, and she's like, here in this school, we know so much about death and dying. We can help people die with dignity. We know a ton about a depressed brain, about a schizophrenic brain. She lives with bipolar disorder, with bipolar. She's like talking about all these neuropathologies and other pathologies. So like, but interestingly enough, if you want to know about life or love, you have to go over there. And she points to the theology school. And I just think there's this interesting opportunity in the 21st century for us as human beings to stop being a moth to a flame and chase after the negative and just like reverse that trajectory. What are the leading causes of life? Because I know the leading causes of death. What are the leading what's my brain look like? What's your brain look like on love? We know that love is this crazy resilience factor. Because it's connection. But like, that's a 4-letter word. Can you say love in scientific environments? And I think there's something really interesting coming out of the science that we're learning, and it lends to the study of resiliency that I think can actually reframe the meaning behind why we as human beings are all have experienced or will experience something traumatic. There is something called post-traumatic growth syndrome. And post-traumatic growth syndrome comes after the trauma, and it mimics some things that we discover in hospice, only that person is dying after having learned the lesson in hospice, and the person with post-traumatic growth isn't going to die yet. And they learn, I wish I would have spent more time with my family. That's a lesson from the dying. I wish I would have done more art. I wish I would have worked so hard. I wish I would have taken more time and had more fun. And I can't remember the fifth one. People in post-traumatic growth say, I wouldn't wish that horrible thing on my worst enemy, but I'm so glad it happened because now I spend more time with my family. My work feels more meaningful. I don't work as often. I'm doing my art and whatever that fifth one is. And part of me wonders, I'm a survivor of some pretty intense traumatic experiences. And I think I'm like flirting with this post-traumatic growth stage. And I kind of wonder if maybe there's something to us getting to post-traumatic growth that makes us free. Because I can tell you in my lived experience that as I approach that, I'm just not as afraid of things as I used to be. And that's like one of our constitutional rights of liberty, where this country was set up for that. We are also set up for life and this pursuit of happiness, something we don't necessarily do. So with that, I'm just wondering, I know y'all know about post-traumatic growth. Do you see us being able to shift our meaning of trauma and our meaning of toxic stress into something that can then create like a cultural shift that helps us hold each other more?
There's a lot there. I'm going to just make one comment that I was thinking about as you were describing that. It doesn't fully answer the question that
Sure.
you did, which is
Too big. I sometimes ask the question that can't be answered, right?
Piece by piece, but people oftentimes think of resilience as being trait-based, right? There's just some people that are stronger than others, and I think that that's the wrong perspective. And so one of the ways that we can grow is by understanding that resilience is trainable, right? This is, the most classic scientific geeky story about this that I can think of is that people studied special forces training as a way of promoting resilience, and they did pre and post training measures. And becoming a Navy SEAL increases your psychiatric or psychological resilience. So it's trainable. I mean, it's something that we need to think about in terms of implementation. We know how to train a mouse in a lab very well. How do we employ it on a larger scale across our communities to be able to train resilience?
Go ahead.
So probably we have all seen, when people have experienced a significant loss, many people want to write about that. And so there are so many books, autobiographies of how people have responded to significant loss or trauma. And some of the ones that I am thinking of in this moment, for instance, Nicholas Wolterstorff is professor emeritus at Yale in philosophical theology, and he wrote Lament for a Son. He has a new book that just came out that I've not read yet, but his son died in a mountain climbing accident, and he reflects on that in terms of his life of faith. And part of what he writes is along these lines of post-traumatic growth or stress-related growth, ways that he can see clearly that he grew through having to deal with this loss. But he's also really clear he'd give it all back to get his son back. And so I feel like that for ministers, that's one of the challenges, and for humans, that's one of the challenges of the line we walk, is to encourage one another to see ways that, given that this has happened and we have no choice but to cope with it, how perhaps am I growing? How could I grow? How could I see this as important for my life story, while not suggesting that therefore this was a good thing. I think that's an important
It gets tricky,
line.
yeah. That's a good point. Thank you.
So I teach medical students the resiliency, science of resiliency, and I was looking up people who we think of as successful or who have recovered successfully, and few traits come out which again are very religious based too, which is gratitude, always focusing on what you have and what is working. Second is how to go beyond your own pain and to reach out to someone else in pain. So volunteering, service-related. So again, it comes back to that we somehow have assumed that religion is like absence of science means religion, and science means absence of religion. And I think that is where the problem I see is happening. And I think that's where we have to bridge the two together.
Because if you think about it, scientists are pretty faith-based. I mean, you don't go to the lab because you're not going to figure the cure for cancer out, or you don't go decide, oh, I can go to the moon, or I can fly a little tiny thing to Mars. I mean, that's faith. You guys believe in that something can be done that seems like completely impossible. So we share, scientists and the religionists or the faith community share so much. And the reality is, I think, that the faith community and the science community want the same end. We're all looking for truth. And the sincere seeker of truth need not fear what he finds, that's Watson, but also need not fear where he finds it or she finds it. And I'll just leave you this one quick thought. And then ask the panelists to leave.
I was wondering if they have questions.
Oh, I forgot about that. Jeez. So questions. Do you have a question? Yes. Yeah, there's a speaker, doodad right here. great
Yeah,
question.
that's a really good question. I actually did a literature search prior to coming here to familiarize myself with the literature around faith, religion, and resilience. It's not huge, and I think that there needs to be more done, but I came across a handful of studies, and in fact, I think that was one of them, trying to define kind of more quantified endpoints of being part of a faith-based community or part of a particular religious group. And it's amazing. I still don't think we really fully understand what it is about being part of this community, the specific variables that can cause changes in our biology that promote resilience. But some of the same things that we're trying to target drugs, like inflammation or cortisol, stress hormone, seem to be affected very dramatically in these nicely placebo-controlled studies of faith-based religion. There's a far greater literature out there about specific psychotherapies, right? So the things that are reimbursed by insurance companies, such as cognitive behavioral therapy. And it's interesting to me how when you start to think about anything that goes beyond drug treatment, all of them seem to have as good of an effect on the endpoint as our, controlled antidepressant therapeutics. Exercise is fantastic. Being part of a community is great. Having good social interaction, having a good social network is great. So it's just, I think we need to, yeah, certainly. But I think we need to understand more about how these things affect our underlying biology. Great question.
Great question. Thank you. Any other?
Just quickly about the negative religious coping. That's why we are very focused on giving the faith leaders the correct language to talk about mental health and mental illnesses, because if not used so they can end up deepening the stigma instead of healing. So we have to be very cognizant of that.
All right, we can take 2, maybe 3 more questions. Right.
There's no casserole coming. So I'm curious again, if you've seen anything in terms of how faith communities rally around and support each other when they have diagnosed mental illness.
So first of all, your
question.
question that do I find differences based on culture and faith? Interestingly, not. What I see is what I see in Muslim community, very prevalent in any other religious community. Same shape. So of course, Harvard has done a study of idioms of distress. How we express depression, how we express our anxiety might be different from culture to culture, but the stigmas, the shade of stigma stays pretty much same. So that one thing. Of course, we all lie on a spectrum when it comes to religiosity and spirituality. So that also kind of define your relationship to God and your level of stigma around, because what we see in faith communities is mental illnesses are taken as like a spiritual weakness. So if I am acknowledging that I'm depressed, then my faith must not be strong enough. And that becomes a big barrier in you accessing care. So that's why we were very focused on the mental health of the faith leaders as well. But coming back to your point that at the same time, that's why I'm very focused in developing community leaders also as mental health workers. Because I think it's gonna take a whole village to combat what we are seeing right now. So did I answer all pieces of the question? But I would be very interested in your findings, so hopefully
Yes.
we can talk more.
Dr. Kelly, do you want to add anything? Okay. Yeah.
That's a great question. We think about this all the time because we're studying complex social behavior based upon antagonistic interactions or aggression, and nobody talks about the aggressor in the equation. Part of it is historical, so I can just give you kind of the historical perspective. From the National Institute of Health perspective, it has not been a priority to study or understand aggression, which has led to the, I would say, crisis in treatment centers. That we just don't have therapeutics that accurately treat the underlying condition, right? So the way that we treat people that are hyper-aggressive right now, my wife is a psychiatrist, so she tells me this all the time, that the biggest problem that they have on the ward is aggressive patients. That is by far the most difficult thing to manage on an inpatient unit. And we sedate them. We give them benzodiazepines, we give them antipsychotic medications, just to keep them quiet. We restrain them. That's our treatment for aggression pathology. We have no understanding of what precipitates the event. There's an underlying, it's an individual. We need to understand the individual and what drives them lashing out into our communities. So I would argue that this is a problem that has failed at all levels, from our funding agencies all the way on up, and I totally agree with you that dealing with this at a community level is critical.
I can tell you my personal challenge with that is, can you imagine Muslim youth, paranoid, psychotic, and aggressive? It becomes a political challenge. So it's been really tricky how we kind of create these interventions. I don't know how many of you know that the Boston bomber, one of the kids had paranoid schizophrenia. And he was hearing commands and delusions clearly before he even became religious. Another point with psychosis is the most common delusions that you get when you are psychotic is religious. So right now, if you put that in perspective of doing Muslim mental health, you can imagine everything becomes countering violent extremism rather than mental health well-being. So the point with that kid was, the paranoid schizophrenia kid, one of the bombers, the parents did not take him for treatment, instead took him to the religious leader. And that is what I was trying to make the point, that by the time mental health providers get involved, it's already a crisis has already happened. So my goal and my hope is that how do we have something already in place that the mental illness doesn't get to that point. And of course, then also, if you have an infrastructure developed, then they know if it is getting to be aggressive, then instead of the imam or the community people trying to handle the kid, a mental health provider can step in. Unfortunately, the truth with mental health situation right now in the country is this is the only specialty that you call the police before you call the provider. And most of our patients are actually incarcerated and in jail. So definitely something has to be done differently, and I think that's a sad note to end on, but you want to say something nice and positive? Something healing?
It's important.
Well, I think what we can say is that there is a movement underway to like share this. There's a couple of places if you're interested. There's taikong.org for folks who are interested in trauma-informed congregations. There's acesconnection.com where you can find where in your local community activists are engaged, both like public health providers and people with lived experience. But thank you for participating, and we are looking forward to building a more resilient nation.